In this way, I desire to greet the Boys Progressive League at their meeting at the Hotel Manhattan. I feel that the Progressive Party should appeal peculiarly to the young men and therefore to the boys.
The clip you just saw was of Theodore Roosevelt, the 23rd President of the United States. At the time, he was the youngest man to ever become president, as he succeeded at the ripe young age of 43. I know, right? So young. And yet, when thinking about some of the greatest presidents in American history, Americans consistently think of Theodore Roosevelt among people like Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. Why? Today, let's look at the life and times of Theodore Roosevelt and why he is remembered so fondly by so many. Theodore Roosevelt was a white man from a very wealthy New York City family. Unlike the classic log cabin presidents like Lincoln, he grew up in a fancy brownstone in New York City. As a young man, he found a seal school, and with it, he started his natural history museum, and this started his love of natural history. Unfortunately, his early life was plagued by his weak health due to his asthma, and he really struggled. Yet he was able to overcome and continue to fight forward. I always find it interesting how this bull moose, tough guy kind of president, absolute cowboy, awesome dude, was not like that as a child. He was a sheltered child, living in a very wealthy family, not log cabin on the frontier. And he had asthma. He was not like what we would think he was, and yet he completely reinvented himself, and I always find that so interesting about the man. After his childhood, he went to Harvard to study natural history, and there he met and married a young woman named Alice Lee, later Roosevelt. Then he joined the then liberal Republican Party and served in the New York City state legislation as a legislator. Unfortunately, a little while later, his wife and his mom died on the same day, and after that bit of a midlife crisis, he spent the next 2 years living on a ranch in the Dakota Territory. He famously loved the outdoors and lived the frontier lifestyle. In fact, he became a deputy sheriff. It's a pretty big shift from rich NYC child to freaking cowboy on the Dakota Territory. After this, he moved back to New York and ran for mayor, portraying himself as a cowboy. Unfortunately, he lost, but a little while later, he got appointed to become the NYPD commissioner. In his role, he fought corruption, and it was this that made President McKinley appoint him to Assistant Secretary of the Navy. In this position, he was very focused on Cuba, and believed that the Cuban people should have freedom, or at least American freedom. So, when the USS Maine was blown up in a Cuban harbor, killing 212 American sailors, he and the country was pissed. He quit his job and used all of his connections to secure himself a job as second lieutenant in the U.S. Volunteer Cavalry. He famously formed the Rough Riders unit and fought with distinction in the Spanish-American War. This made him very popular and paved his way to become governor of New York. After that, President McKinley appointed him to be his vice president. However, it's not why you think it was. The Republican bigwigs in New York didn't really like him and wanted him out of the way. So, McKinley appointed him to his vice presidentship so he wasn't in such a powerful position in New York and that he could keep an eye on him. Fortunately for the country, this is not where Roosevelt would stay. Unfortunately, though, President McKinley was shot and assassinated. What this meant, however, was that Roosevelt, the person they had tried to move into a position to get away, became the President of the United States. He was also at the time the youngest man ever appointed to such an office. So, the eyes of the world were on Roosevelt. What would he do in his presidency? Well, it turns out a lot, and he was very good at it. He was a strong believer in workers' rights, famously touting a square deal for all workers. He famously enforced the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1902 to break up the Railroad Corporation, and famously initiated over 43 government lawsuits against big businesses, leading up to the breakup of companies like Standard Oil. In 1903, he created the Bureau of Corporations to regulate the companies, and in 1902, he became the first president to intervene in a labor strike, and even more more, the first president to do so inexplicably on the side of the workers. Using his sweet talk and clever tactics, he ended up ending the strike and getting the workers a small pay increase. He also wanted to help the American people by passing the Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 to make sure we were eating more and to make sure the food industry was regulated. This came after the investigative journalism of Upton Sinclair. In 1902, the Hepburn Act, he created the first real regulatory agency of the United States. He also famously loved nature and in 1906 created the Antiquities Act, which created the national parks and protected America's natural beauty. Roosevelt is also known for his foreign policy. He helped Panama gain its independence in 1903 and started work on the Panama Canal, a hugely important water connection connecting the Pacific and the Atlantic. This was another part of his idea to make the US a world power and to have it intervene on the world stage. His foreign policy could be summed up by his famous line, "Speak softly, carry a big stick." He understood that by taking colonies from Spain, we were now a world power. So he modernized our Navy and sent it on a great world tour to show the world the United States is ready for the next stage in its history. He also became a world mediator and negotiator when he mediated the Japanese and Russian War, bringing the idea of a powerful, benevolent United States taking care of the world to countries around the world. Our superpower status can arguably be directly contributed to him. He ended his term in March 1909 and is still hailed as one of the greatest presidents of all time. After leaving the Republican Party, he created a successor, President Taft, who was not like Roosevelt. He was a more conservative Republican, and his policies reflected his ideals instead of the more progressive policies of Theodore Roosevelt. Needless to say, that is not what Roosevelt hoped for the future of his party, and he hoped it would be progressive like he was. However, before he can get back to politics, he was busy in Africa. He famously went on a year-long safari through Africa, funded by the Smithsonian, cataloging, killing, and shipping things back to US museums. He sent back the skins of over 1,000 large mammals, 4,000 small mammals, and in total 11,400 items. You know these elephants at the Natural History Museums? Yeah, those were the ones he brought back. But enough about him gallivanting in Africa. Let's go back to politics. Getting back into politics, in 1912, he tried to return to his party and ran against Taft for the nomination. But he lost, so he said, "To hell with this, I'm starting my own party." And he left the Republicans. He called his new party the Progressive Party, because it was progressive, also known as the Bull Moose Party, which, after hearing about his life, a bull moose pretty accurately describes him. He campaigned on greater government regulation of the economy and the promotion of social welfare programs. In fact, while giving a speech, Roosevelt got shot with, I believe, a .32 caliber bullet, and yet it hit his glasses case, so he survived. But bro lived the rest of his life with a .32 caliber in his side. What's even crazier is after getting shot, he finished giving the speech while bleeding out. He didn't run away. He finished giving his speech. That is the most Teddy Roosevelt thing ever. And that's the most bull moose thing ever. Unfortunately, Teddy Roosevelt lost the election, but he did gain an impressive 88 electoral votes, which if you think about it is kind of crazy. He was not running on either of the major party, but instead starting his own party from scratch, and he got 88 electoral votes. That is pretty good. All in all, Teddy Roosevelt has had an amazing life, doing everything to everything. So that's the life and times of Teddy Roosevelt. Unfortunately, just like anything, all great things must come to an end. After suffering breathing problems, Roosevelt died on January 5th, 1909. Following a private farewell service in the North Room at Sagamore Hill, a simple funeral was held at the Christ Episcopal Church in Oyster Bay on January 8th. In attendance were many, many people, all mourning the death of a great president and just a great guy. Fun fact, it included President Howard Taft, who ran against him, but showing the respect they had for this truly great man, who was truly a force in American politics.